in the, thanks, Alan.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So
Uh,
I think we're gonna jump in.
um, couldn't get it.
Oh, Julie, are you having trouble finding these things?
I got Isaac Luria in Kabbalah, and I'm not able to print that out. But that's probably not, that doesn't sound like what you recommended with,
Right, that I think that's the background reading for Kim.
okay. So,
Um,
so, right,
you want
I
you
know the Sephirot chart. I mean, I
okay.
recognize that, but the other you mentioned, the first thing,
The first thing is called Zohar Texts for Session 2.
does everybody see that?
It's at the top of the it's at the top of the list in that folder. It should be the first text that's in there.
Oh, well, I'm not, oh, okay. Uh, no, no, the one to,
Okay.
when
All
I
right.
did Isaac.
Steve, on mine, it was the last thing that came up.
Oh, it was. Okay, so I apologize. All right, so it's going to look different, I guess, in each person's
Okay.
version of it. Which is kind of surprising, but
Yeah,
the yeah, right. The Google
yeah,
Doc.
it is the last thing on mine.
Okay. Thanks,
Okay,
Nancy. And
so I'll
okay.
try to print it now.
Okay. All
Thank you.
right. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a review from last time for people who may not have both if for people who may not have been able to be there, and also it's been a little bit since we met the last time. So just uh, the second session really focused on the emergence of the official Kabbalah, which started in 12th century southern France and then moved into Spain, where it really blossomed. Um, and basically, I just want to say about that these early Kabbalistic schools evolved from the latter half of the 12th century over the next 100 years, culminating in the writing of the Zohar at the end or towards the end of the 13th century by Moses de Leon, um, and his school. He did not uh, want to take personal credit for it, um, but pretty much, I think anyone who studies this with a scholarly orientation is in agreement that some combination of Moses de Leon and his school are the authors of the Zohar. Um, and I also wanted to mention these three categories again of Kabbalah that have existed really across all strata of the Jewish mystical tradition and within Kabbalah proper as well. And those three categories are the theosophical category, the ecstatic or prophetic category, and the practical or magical category. And the the Zoharic mysticism or Zoharic Kabbalah is mostly an expression of the theosophical branch of Jewish mysticism, and that branch is really that's the dominant branch throughout history. The other two branches have existed side by side, but they've never been as popular as the theosophical branch. And basically, what theosophical Kabbalah and theosophical mysticism are focused on is they are interested in understanding the underlying divine structure of the universe and also the ways in which the human and divine worlds interpenetrate and impact on one another. That is kind of, so it's kind of, it's very much an ideas-based approach to mysticism, and with the understanding that when you understand, when you discern uh, how things truly operate underneath the surface, then you have a better appreciation for how you have to go about living your life if you want to live in alignment with that reality. So That's the theosophical category. Ecstatic, we haven't talked so much about. That was more, we talked more about it in the first session, but that's the practice, the mystical practices that actually change a person's consciousness. They have very often have visions, and sometimes, very deep insights into the nature of reality that don't come from studying sacred text, that come from this
Yeah.
personal experience of ecstasy, or prophecy that they go through. So that's and there are schools of Kabbalah and of mysticism which are really focused on teaching practices that bring people to those experiences. So that's the second school, and then the third category, practical or magic, which is really focused on, you know, manipulating the universe in ways that, are supposed to be positive, um, uh, but it's held in very low esteem among the other schools of Kabbalah, and part of the reason why is that there is an understanding that when you engage in this kind of practical magical um, uh, activity, it's it's inherently a mixture of good and evil. You can't separate the two ultimately. And so anyone who dabbles in this is, you have to be like at a very, very high pure level to do this in the way that it's supposed to be done, and almost nobody's at that level. And there's always a suspicion of people who do this kind of thing and what's motivating them and how much of it is coming from kind of selfishness and ego as opposed to wanting to be of service. So it's there. It's probably, this is the kind of stuff, if you've ever heard, I'm sure many of you have heard of these places called Kabbalah centers that are so popular across the United States, especially in New York and Los Angeles. And they don't, I should be careful because I haven't visited a Kabbalah center, but my understanding, and just from kind of the kind of um, the way they make news about themselves, is it sounds like they're very focused on the magical elements of the tradition. Like the most famous example is like Madonna wearing a red thread around her wrist that she learned about at the Kabbalah Center, in Los Angeles. So, that's practical Kabbalah, and again, a someone who comes out of a more traditional Kabbalistic orientation would really look down and askance, at people who are involved in that. So, all right. So, we said that the Zohar is primarily theosophical and really all about understanding the underlying structure of the universe, how, and how divinity and humanity participate in that. Um, we talked last time about, with the Zohar and with Kabbalah proper, we have this really um, new understanding of God, and that understanding has two dimensions. The first dimension is called Ein Sof, which means basically the infinite, and the Kabbalists say that dimension of God, Ein Sof, is completely beyond any human ability to understand or conceive or experience. So with that part of that dimension of divinity, the Kabbalists, at least in principle, are very much in alignment with the medieval philosophers who, when they talked about God, they said that, we can't say anything about God because God is beyond human conception. And so the Kabbalists would say, yeah, well, that's true for the Ein Sof dimension of the divine. But then there's this other whole dimension called the Sfirot, the attributes, the emanations of divinity. It's the bridge that brings this reality that is infinite, it bridges that reality into the finite, because they had to explain, like, if you have an infinite deity, how does that, how can there be finiteness in a universe that is created by something that has no boundary or limit? And so the Sfirot help to answer that question for the Kabbalists. They say, well, there's this kind of bridge of emanations that takes place, and at the highest levels, they're barely, they're still mostly part of Ein Sof and just kind of barely, putting a little toe into this other reality, which is more finite and concrete. And then as you go down the ladder of the 10 emanations, the bottom one being Shekhinah, we're going to talk about those 10 tonight. We were supposed to do it last week. We didn't get to it, so we're going to talk about them a little bit tonight. But that is how, from the Kabbalistic perspective, you move from an infinite creator, an infinite divinity, to a finite universe. Okay. So, and these 10 Sfirot, these 10 emanations, this was a radical innovation in comparison to kind of mainstream rabbinic Judaism. And I say that and that doesn't discount the fact that a lot of mainstream rabbis also studied Kabbalah, but the way that the rabbis talked about God in more, in texts that were not explicitly mystical is very different from the way that the Zohar talks about God. And so this idea that divinity would have different dimensions to it, that would be kind of scandalous, certainly to the philosophers, because for them, what made God God was that God was a perfect unity. And so to talk about God being divided, even if those divisions were all interconnected, that did not play well with them. And the rabbis, the more mainstream rabbis, would not have been super comfortable, because the way that the Kabbalists talk about these 10 aspects of divinity, there are many parts of the descriptions that don't sound like traditional theology. They're very earthy, some of the descriptions. Let me put it that way. And so to talk about God in earthy terms would have been very disturbing to certain, schools of mainstream rabbis. Okay, so I think this is where we got to at the end of the last session, where this idea that from the Zoharic Kabbalistic perspective, creation takes place on two levels simultaneously. There is a process that occurs in a hidden way in the upper worlds that is generated by the Sfirot, but there's a parallel process of manifestation that occurs in the lower world, which is the world that human beings, and it's the physical world. And those two worlds are in some ways very different, but they are also incredibly connected to each other, because the same processes, the same elements drive the processes in the upper worlds and the lower worlds. The upper worlds, the worlds of the Sfirot more purely, are ideally in perfect harmony, but the lower material world is characterized inherently by flaws and disharmonies. That's one of the differences, the contrast between the two worlds. Even so, the lower world parallels and corresponds to the upper world in its structure. Both worlds are structured along the lines of the 10 Sfirot, and everything in the lower world is invested with divine vitality, so that there is a real continuity and an integral connection between the two levels of reality. So even though they are manifesting in different ways, they are intimately connected to each other, the lower world and the upper world. So this idea leads to the radical notion that human beings and the physical world more generally and the transcendent realm are in a mutual and dynamic relationship, and that human actions have effects for good or for ill on the upper worlds, and if they have those effects on the upper worlds, it's tantamount to saying that they have those effects on the divine, because that is, the upper worlds are in fact an emanation of divinity. So this is a very, in some ways you could say, like, Heschel would have said that God was a God, was affected by human behavior, right? Heschel would talk about the prophets and how, God responds to human actions. So there is a kind of, cause and effect thing going on there, but that's often God either being upset or disappointed with human behavior and responding to those, whatever that means in divine terms. But this is really different because this is saying, first of all, it's saying that let me say one more thing that I think again was kind of surprising to people last time, that in Kabbalah, the story of Adam and Eve and the garden is understood as a metaphorical description of the kind of the negative beginnings of the material world. That because of Adam and Eve's sin, in Kabbalistic, at least in part of the Kabbalistic tradition, that is understood as the causative factor that creates the lower worlds to begin with. Like the first creation, Adam Kadmon, the primal human in Kabbalistic understanding, was not physical in any way. And then because of the sin, when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, that is understood as being kicked out of the upper worlds and being placed on this lower world, which is physical and has all the challenges of the physical and concrete that we are well acquainted with. So human behavior can actually help to restore the cosmic harmony that has been disturbed ever since the sin of Adam and Eve. And we talked a little bit about how this is kind of interesting from kind of a Jewish Christian perspective, that a lot of Jewish people don't think of the story of Adam and Eve occupies a very different place in Jewish tradition and Christian tradition, which is true, but in Kabbalistic tradition it's less true. It's a very different way of framing why what happened, but still the idea that it represents a kind of a primary break in the harmony of the cosmos that needs to be repaired in some way. There is a parallel there. Okay. Let's see here. So, all right, let's, but this idea, I guess the core thing I wanted to underscore here is this idea that human beings, the actions, and even the thoughts of human beings are impactful in the upper worlds, and human beings are impacted by what's going on in the upper worlds. That flows down into the lower world. There's this, there's a reciprocal dynamic between the two levels of reality. And so that's a pretty radical idea that comes along with the Zohar and the first stage of Kabbalah. All right, let's just talk a little bit more in detail about the Sfirot. Now I know that there are a bunch of people here who have studied the Sfirot in various contexts, so I am not a Sfirot expert. We're just going to walk through. If you have the chart, that is the Sfirot chart that is in that Google folder, you can open it up. It's got a, and Lila, I just want to say I thanked you at the beginning for sending all those beautiful images of the spherotic tree that you did after the first session, and those are most of them are in the Google Doc now that people can download.
Steve, can you screen share? Put those on there?
I guess I can. You know what? Because I'm going to kind of walk through, and then afterwards I can stop the screen share, and then people can and then people can ask questions or make comments. All right, so let me do the screen share. One sec. Okay, I do this. Do this. And okay, it's sideways. I apologize, but can you see? Oh, there's a, look at that. All right. So it's sideways. And then on the other half of the page, there's a series of words or terms that are associated with each of these 10 levels. But I'm just gonna walk through. Okay, at the top of the tree, I guess I can't really. Can you see my little hand on the screen? Oh, cool. Okay. Oh, so I have a little pointer. Okay, that's good to know. All right. So here, this is supposed to be at the top if it were vertical, right? I don't know if there's a way to change the orientation. I'm not going to try to do that now, but this is the top of the tree here. It's Keter or crown, and this first sphira is understood as the bridge from divine concealment to the beginning of manifestation. It's also called primal will. It's also called divine nothingness. So it's so much something that it's called divine nothingness. It's barely over the line. It's still really closely connected to the infinite part of God, but it's got will. There's a little bit of will in there, and so that brings it already out of the infinite and into something a little more focused and intentional. So that's the top of the tree. And then out of this primal will comes two sphirot called Bina and Chokhmah, which are, understanding and wisdom in a literal translation. And Chokhmah on the right side of the chart is understood as having male characteristics, and Bina is understood as having female characteristics. By the way, this male and female stuff was part of what made Kabbalah so radical, that within divinity, you find, both male and female energies. That was not something that was talked about by the rabbis pre-Kabbalistically. So Chokhmah is called the beginning, the primal point, and it's also called the upper father. Chokhmah is called the upper father, and it is known as the first discernible aspect of divinity. And then Bina is called the upper mother, and is also called womb, and also building or palace. So this is the first kind of divine couple of energies. And again, the male and female, and then they together give birth to the 7 lower sephirot. The rest of the chart all come out of the union of Chokhmah and Bina. And these top 3, Chokhmah, Bina, and Keter, even though I said before that, that the sephirot were accessible to the human mind or to the human imagination, these top 3 are really not quite accessible. They make the bottom 7 accessible. They're the bridge between the infinite, which is completely inaccessible, but human beings can't really understand too much about what goes on with Keter and Bina and Chokhmah. All right. So now we're going to go now to the bottom 7, which are the most they play the most active role in terms of this kind of reciprocal relationship between the lower and upper worlds. So below Bina and Chokhmah, we have kind of a second set of male and female, with Chesed and Gevura. These are, Chesed and Gevura are probably the most, in some ways, besides Shekhinah, Chesed and Gevura are probably the most popular of the Sfirot because they get, Chesed is loving kindness or overflowing love, and Gevura is the opposite. Gevura is boundary setting and strength, and even, yeah, it's limitation. And so you're meant to have a mixture that when things are working correctly, there's a balance of Chesed and Gevura in the universe and in our own psyches and everything in between. That we should be in touch with our capacity to offer overflowing love, but we also need to be able to have boundaries around that. And and then Tiferet, which is in the middle and one half level down, is the point that keeps Chesed and Gevura in balance with each other. Now it's interesting that one of the names for Tiferet in Hebrew is Hakadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One. Blessed be He, or the Blessed Holy One. So in Kabbalistic understanding, it is Tiferet. Often when they're reading about God in the Torah, and there's a reference to God, what their understanding is that refers to Tiferet. That it doesn't refer to the upper Sfirot, and it doesn't refer to Ein Sof, because Ein Sof you can't even say anything about. So right here, Tiferet is the location in the Sphirotic tree that is associated with the way that God is described in the Torah for many Kabbalists. So the balance point of Chesed and Gevura. Okay. Then we go down to the next pair of Netzach and Hod. Personally, I find these to be the most obscure of the Sfirot. Maybe people here can shed some light on that in a little bit. Netzach and Hod are, some people talk about them as two aspects of divine rulership. One has to do with the compassionate ruler, and one has to do with the regal monarch. So one is the approachable ruler, and one is the awesome, awe-inspiring ruler. And below Netzach and Hod, you have what's here, the Sphira, the ninth Sphira of Yesod, which means foundation, literally. And Yesod is the vehicle by which all the energies of the upper Sphirot flow into the bottom Sphira, which is Shekhinah or Malchut. And Yesod is often imaged in male sexual terms, even as Malchut and Shekhinah is imaged in female sexual terms. And Shekhinah is called the lower mother, queen, and bride, and she is the lover of Tiferet. So Tiferet and Shekhinah are a couple, and Yesod is the vehicle by which they are connected to each other. And when things are working well in the upper worlds, Tiferet and Shekhinah, or Tiferet and Malchut, are interacting in a healthy way. And when things are getting a little chaotic in the upper worlds, it's because things are out of sorts or out of balance between Tiferet and Shekhinah, Tiferet and Malchut. So there's maybe some of you are familiar, there's a Kabbalistic, a traditional expression that is often said before we perform a commandment. That's something like, I'm not going to get the exact quote, but it's something like L'shem kudsha brichu ushechinte. I am doing this action in order to facilitate the connection between the Kadosh Baruch Hu and his Shekhinah. And what that's talking about is Tiferet, the middle balanced part of the Sephirotic tree, and the bride of Tiferet, which is Shekhinah and Malchut. So the Kabbalists, for a long time, and many people do this today, and it's become, more mainstream in some traditional Orthodox circles, is to recite this. It's kind of like the basic kavanah in Kabbalistic tradition. The kavanah is whatever the mitzvah is, whatever the commandment is, I'm doing it for the sake of the unification of Kudsha Brichu and Shechinte. And that is what we're talking about. We're talking about these two, the sixth Sephira and the 10th Sephira. Okay, so the dynamics of the upper parents, Chochmah and Bina, those are protected from the chaos of the lower part of the upper world and of the lower world. So Chochmah and Bina are always in good relationship with each other. But as we said before, Tiferet and Malchut is where the problem arises. And it's when human actions can help out the upper world, what we are doing, according to Kabbalistic understanding, is we are facilitating a positive dynamic between these two sfirot. That is what our actions are accomplishing if we are focused in the right way as we do them. Okay, I wanted to say one more thing, and then I want to stop and see if people have questions or comments. But so all of these 10 sfirot are imaged in a wide range of ways in the Zohar, and it's kind of mind-blowing, all the different ways that these sfirot are imaged. So I'm just gonna, on that document, actually, here, I'm gonna move it down. You can see here, you have the Hebrew, on the left side of the page, you have the Hebrew term in transliterated English. Then you have the translation of the meaning of the Hebrew name of Sphirah. There are names of God that are associated with each of the Sphirot, traditionally. And then in addition to those names of God, there are all these other categories of symbols that are used. So let me just give you them, collectively. So the Sphirot are associated with different biblical personalities. They're associated with parts of the human body. They're associated with different elements of divine speech. They're associated with the spectrum of color. So each sphira is also thought of as being associated with a particular color on the spectrum. And they also each are associated with different cosmic and earthly elements, like the four directions or the sun and the moon. Those are also part of it. So if you just look down this list here, like Keter, you've got the colors white and black, interestingly enough, associated with Keter. Chochmah, he doesn't list a color, or Bina. Chesed, also, I don't know why there's no color listed here, but red, that kind of makes sense. For Gevura is red because, again, it's when things are out of balance, by the way, between Chesed and Gevura, between love and boundaries, or love and limitation. If Gevura gets out of control, that is understood as the source of evil in the universe. When there's too much Gevura and not enough Chesed, it's not good to have too much Chesed either, but too much Gevura is worse in terms of really bad things happen when there's too much Gevura coming into the world at one time. Again, biblical personalities. We've got Abraham is Chesed, Isaac is Gevura, Jacob is Tiferet, Moses is Netzach, Aaron is Hod, Joseph is Yesod, and King David or Rachel, interestingly, King David is Malchut or Shekhinah. Okay. I think that's what I wanted to share about and let me just say, if you're feeling a little confused, that is totally normal. And, I think that these are very deep and rich symbols, and they have so many different dimensions to them. It's really difficult to kind of zero in and say, well, this Sephirah is exactly this energy. But all right, I'm going to stop sharing. And let me just see if there are any questions or comments at this point before we go on to our next piece. I know this was not new for a lot of people, so let me just okay. Everyone feels okay about things up to this point. All right. Oh, Ron, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, this is just a general thought that occurred to me. If you're looking at the literature, do you find anything that could be construed as the use of something like psychedelics?
Huh. Well, that's a great question. So I want to just say I am not hyper conversant with the literature, but I will tell you that there are physical positions, and then maybe Bob has something to say about this too. There are physical positions that people talk about assuming when people are being taught about how to experience, ecstatic states. And I feel like I've read, and this is not Kabbalah proper, but people talking about some of the prophets actually in the biblical period making reference to certain plants. I have not actually tracked that down personally, so I'm a little bit hesitant to say for sure. But physical postures, absolutely, in terms of using those postures as a way of entering a different state of consciousness. So yeah, great. Anything else on that, Ron?
No, it just seems that at least the Westerners who have had transcendent experience often have had happen with the use of psychedelics at some point. Ramdas example.
Right.
Steve, when you say
Yeah,
positions, do you mean
great.
something akin to yoga? I mean, physical
Oh.
positions?
So
Yeah.
the one that I'm thinking about, and this might be a yoga position. I don't know as much about yoga as I would like to, but there's a position where someone is instructed to sit on the ground and put their head between their knees. Like that's a position that's supposed to, create some kind of opening to ecstatic experience. Are there yogic positions, Bob, that are believed or known to lead to that kind of experience?
No, I know nothing about yoga. I was just curious.
Okay. That's a good question too.
The whole process of yoga is meant to lead to higher states of consciousness.
Okay. Right. It makes me think, I mean, this would take us down a little bit of a different pathway, but the idea, like to me, the idea of yoga where you're practicing, like, I feel like with yoga, you're aiming for a consistent transformation of consciousness. Like some of these other postures feel like, these were journeys that people went on and then kind of came back to like normal consciousness, whatever that means. but anyway, that's that. I appreciate that. That's helpful, Ron. Um,
You know,
Lila? Yeah.
I was just going to say, sitting with your head between your knees, that's what you do so you don't pass out. That's like EMT, not yoga. I would think that that would make you less likely to have an ecstatic experience, but
So interesting. Yeah, I can't speak to it personally, but I've definitely read that particular description of, I think Abraham Abulafia, that was one of the things that he talked about. But he had a lot of different ways that he drew upon to help people enter this state.
so I do have a serious question,
Yeah.
which is about, I mean, it feels like this is like a lot of hooey, in some ways. I mean, I'd love a better description of what the spiritual, like, how do people use like the visual of the Sephiroth? How does that inspire us kind of change in spiritual state? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, how does that help people? I mean, is it like the actual visual prompt, or is it like just you keep that structure in your mind while you're trying to reach one of those stages?
So that's a great question. If you don't mind holding it for just a little while, Lila, because I hope we're gonna get to talk a little bit about Isaac Luria and Sfat tonight too, and I think when we get there, we'll be able to talk a little bit more about the answer to that question, or one answer to that question. So yeah, that's great. All right, Mark, and then I saw Carol with her hand up too, I think.
This is going back a ways, but I was going to say on the question of yoga, there are a number of people out there that are trying to draw links between Jewish spirituality broadly, at least, and yoga postures. And back when Hamakom was a presence here, when Rabbi Simcha Zevet was still in town, I don't remember their names anymore, but we brought in a rabbi, a woman from Philadelphia, who did a number of yoga sessions at the JCC. And there's some books on this where some of the postures can resemble Hebrew letters.
Oh, right.
And people kind of then associate words with, words that start with those letters and try to generate intentionality in the middle of those postures. I don't even think that rabbi really tied it to every one of the Sefirot, but it was a good 10 years ago, probably. The wild thing, just to show how much this intrigues people, I think over 200 people, or close to 200 people, came over one weekend to learn about this at the time. And so.
Yeah, no,
I think like a lot of these things, to be honest, I mean, I think if you really scour all the ancient literature, yeah, there are things around postures. I think you were alluding to this. I've seen very complicated charts, right, where you say every consonant in the Hebrew alphabet with every vowel in the Hebrew alphabet in a chain, like all 22 times 5, nodding your head back and forth in different motions while you're doing that. And to go off what Lila was just saying, if you're swinging your head around about 220 times in rapid succession, maybe that brings about at least dizziness, maybe a parallel to some kind of enlightened consciousness. But there were, I think most people don't practice this, but it was one of the links I remember between physicality and physical expression, let's say, and the theosophical ideas in Kabbalah.
Thank you, Mark. That's great. I'll just also add to what you said about the yoga postures, the connecting. I've also seen not lots. I've seen charts that look at the chakra system and the sphirot and draw very close connections between them too. So, I think that's like, it's not surprising to me that esoteric traditions in different, slightly different parts of the world have developed understandings or, structures that seem like they are, trying to get at similar kinds of ideas. Carol, did you want to jump in before?
You stole my thunder. I was just going to say that I know, there have been certain comparisons to the chakra system with the body, and to me there are some link. It kind of lines up a little bit, but I know there's that. And the other thing, from my very limited, when I went on a Kabbalah tour, it was mainly in Safat, but it was with this renewal rabbi from Australia. It was a few years ago, and we were in different places and studied with different people. I mean, it was very overwhelming because each teacher was presenting something different. It was pretty rapidly presented. But the other thing to appreciate is how much the Sefirot, for every religion like Kabbalah, I think there's something in some of the churches there. I mean, these charts have different, may have different names, but there's parallels, and they're all over. They're really in a lot of places in the Mideast. And also, I forgot, I think they said that there might be something in Rome, but I mean, they were used, it was mystical from Judaism, but there is an adaptation to Christianity. It was never really explained to us, but I know there were different ways that the charts were drawn that didn't always line up with this, but it was similar,
Mm-hmm. Right. No, absolutely. There is actually a Christian Kabbalistic tradition that I think really emerges after Isaac Luria, and that kind of, where there was some teaching and, cross-pollination, and there were certain Christian scholars that were very, very interested in Kabbalah, and they're, yeah. So absolutely, that is.
No, that was the other thing. It was I mean, it was derived from Lur. I mean, it seemed like it was first the Jewish mystics, but it was adapted,
Absolutely. So yeah, no, that sounds. I remember when you went on that tour.
I remember we even went with this rabbi where he was lining it up. But again, this is all modern Madonna type stuff, I think. But we were doing Tai Chi with the Tai Chi rabbi. We did some Tai Chi that lined up this road. But I wouldn't say that any of this is truly grounded. It was interesting, but the big thing that they kept emphasizing is the chakra, that there's breath and chakra and that type of thing. But I think, again, a more modern adaptation.
Right. One thing I think, one more, I don't think I said this the last time. I just want to emphasize it, that the Kabbalists are the ones who came up with the division of the soul into different levels. That's a Kabbalistic. So, a lot of people are familiar with Nefesh and Ruach and Neshama as 3 levels. Then there are 2 other levels, and I'm not actually sure when those 2 other levels came into the conversation, but initially it was 3 levels, and it was the soul that was most connected to the Sfirot in the upper world. So, and the higher the level of soul that was active, the stronger the connection would be. So human beings had the highest potential of interacting with the energies of the upper world because we have the potential, at least, to develop our neshama, which is the highest, at least classically, the highest level of soul. Ruach has some of that, and Nefesh has less of that. But it's that at least in early Kabbalah, that was the point of contact between the upper and lower worlds, was the soul of the creature. All right. I thought we would just take a little taste of a piece of Zohar. It's actually, again, I do not have a lot of experience teaching Zohar text, so we're just gonna do a taste of it, and it's, I think there's what we're gonna see is a pattern that gets repeated many times in the context of the Zohar, and you'll get the idea pretty quickly if you don't have it already. But the Zohar texts, were people able to get that, or should I screen share? Okay. All right. I will do that. Here we go. All right. Where? All right, one sec. Hold on. That's not what I want. I want this. Okay. I think I can share this now. That's weird. What's this? That's still the sphere chart, but that's not what I'm looking for. Sorry, I don't know. Why is this? What is this? No, that is not what I'm looking for. Wait, let me try. Hold on, I apologize. I'm just trying to get, oh, I see. Maybe this will help. Oh, actually, hold on. I see what I was doing wrong. Here. Okay. I got it. Okay. You guys see these? Yeah? Okay. So let's just, would someone be willing to read just this top paragraph here, from Zohar 3, 152a? Because this is a really kind of basic, this orients us towards all study from a Kabbalistic perspective. I can only see 3 or 4 people, so unless you electronically raise your hand, I won't know if you're willing to read.
I'll read. I'm trying to find where my
Okay, that's fine.
okay. It says, thus the tales related to the Torah are simply her outer garments, and woe to the person who regards that outer garb as the Torah itself. For such a person will be deprived of a portion in the world to come. Open thou mine eyes, that I may behold wondrous things out of thy law. That is to say, the things that are underneath. Just as wine must be in a jar to keep, so the Torah must be contained in an outer garment. The garment is made up of the tales and stories, but we are bound to penetrate beyond.
Thanks, Alan. So, all right. So just so it's very clear what this text is saying here, right? The Torah as we normally experience it, we read, Jewish communities around the world every week open up the scroll and they read. And the Zohar is saying that the stuff that we read about is really, it's very, it's not the meat of what the Torah is saying. It's really just, it's a gateway to what is most important about the Torah. Now, people who interpret the Torah, they come up with really, insightful and inspiring interpretations, but the Zohar would say anything that is tied too closely to the surface level of the Torah is just missing the boat. I mean, this here it's saying you lose your portion in the world to come if you don't get to the real stuff. It's like it's a significant, you're missing out in a really big way if you just read the stories and the laws as if that is what the Torah is really supposed to be about. Now, I don't have the name of this Hasidic master, but one of the Hasidic masters at one point said something to the effect of, if it weren't for the Zohar, I would not have remained a Jew. And one of the things he meant by that is that he couldn't accept that the content of the Torah could be a divine revelation because it was so mundane. He's like, why would God say these things? You know, it's like, it doesn't make sense. If God were going to reveal truth to people, it wouldn't be stories about families where people fight with each other, and, you know, it wouldn't be about laws that, you know, I'm exaggerating it a little bit, but there was a Hasidic master who said, you know, thank God for the Zohar because it showed me that I needed to go beyond the surface level. So that's the whole. And once you internalize that perspective, then everything you read, you're looking for once you have the sfirot as a key to understanding the text, then everything you read, you're on the lookout. Your ears are like attuned to, you know, which sfirah is being talked about here. So let's just look, for example, and again, this is going to be a little bit confusing, and I apologize. It's just something we have to get used to, because the Zohar is you know, it operates in its own universe, and similar to the way the Talmud does. Like, you just have to you have to learn the system. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this from Emor. So this is from a part of Leviticus that's talking about the holiday of Sukkot. Okay, talking about Sukkot, and this is a commentary on the Torah's description of Sukkot in the Zohar. Rabbi Elazar opened with, "Thus says God, I remember in your favor the devotion of your youth." So this is actually a very midrashic thing to do, where you're looking at the Torah, you bring another verse from one of the other two parts of the Bible, from the writings or from the prophets, and then you tie the two together. It's a very common midrashic process. And it looks like these starting out the same way. Oh, I'm going to quote Jeremiah. He quotes Jeremiah. God is saying in Jeremiah, I remember in your favor the devotion of your youth. So God is remembering in Jeremiah how the Israelites, when they were wandering in the desert, that it was this beautiful time between God and the Israelites. Even though we know, by the way, that if you go back and look at that description in the Torah, there were lots of parts of it that weren't so beautiful or easy, right? There were lots of times when God got angry, but that's besides the point. Jeremiah is having God remembering it in a very positive way. This verse, so here's the Zohar. This verse was said about the congregation of Israel or Israel, which is Malchut, when she was walking with Israel. I think that might be a misprint. When she was walking with Israel in the wilderness. So the first thing, the congregation of Israel is another name for Shekhinah. Shekhinah is called the congregation of Israel. So when you're reading the Torah and you see a reference to the collective of Israel, the Kabbalah says, oh, that's not about the Jewish people. That's a code name for Shekhinah. It's a code name for the 10th Sphirah of God. So that if you really want to know what's going on in this text, God isn't talking about the Jewish people here. God is talking about God's relationship with Shekhinah. Okay. So I remember in your favor, and the word for favor is chesed in Hebrew, and of course chesed we know is a sphira, right? It is the chesed and gevura. It's that pair, that 4 and 5 in the tree. So what does chesed refer to? It refers to Aaron's cloud. All right. There's so many things going on in this text. There's a rabbinic midrash where there's an argument about when it says that the Israelites lived in booths in Sukkot. One of the rabbis say, well, they lived in actual physical booths. They built these structures and they lived in them. And another rabbi says, no. They weren't physical booths. They were spiritual, and they were like clouds. They were like divine clouds. that covered the people and protected them. So it's the word booth is a metaphor in the Torah according to this Talmudic rabbi. And now this Zoharic text is borrowing the idea of clouds. I know it's like just follow the bouncing ball here. Borrowing the idea of clouds and saying that Chesed actually is one of the clouds. And there's another midrash that says there were 7 clouds. Oh my gosh, 7. That's the 7 lower sfirot, beginning with Chesed and Gevura. So, and as we know, each sphira is associated with a biblical personage. So, when the text says, when Jeremiah says, I remember in your favor, this is talking about one of the clouds, one of the 7 clouds, which was Aaron's cloud. And Aaron's cloud traveled with 5 other clouds. The cloud of Gevurah, the cloud of Tiferet, the cloud of Netzach and Hod and Yesod that joined you and shone upon you. And the you in this text is Shekhinah. So these are all, so the Zohar is reading this whole text about Sukkot as a text about the 7 Sfirot. And then he quotes Jeremiah again and says, your love as a bride, as those clouds that incorporated you, adorned you, and bedecked you as a bride wearing her jewelry, because you did go after me in the wilderness in a land not sown. So this whole conversation is imagined as a conversation between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Shekhinah. It's not about God talking to the Jewish people. Or if it is about that, it's really, that's not the important part of it. The important part is that this is a conversation, this is a description of interactions between different parts of the Sephirotic tree. And it's, oh, Mimi, did you want to say something?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I accidentally unmuted. I'm listening though.
Okay, no problem. So again, it's the only other, I don't know that it's worthwhile. I mean, this is going to continue. There are 2 other sections here that are talking about different expressions of the Sfirot when it comes to Sukkot. And I think many of us are familiar with the custom that during Sukkot, we have every night there is what's called a supernal guest, where you invite what we say we are, in our, like in the Reconstructionist prayer book, those guests are given names, biblical names like Abraham and Sarah or Rebecca and Isaac. But and we say that those biblical people represent different qualities, but we don't come right out and say, the Reconstructionist prayer book doesn't come right out and say, but what you're really inviting into your sukkah is the energy of that particular sphira. It's a divine emanation is what you're inviting into your sukkah. So we think about it often as, oh, we're inviting the spirit of Abraham. But it's actually a bigger deal than that from the Kabbalistic point of view. You're inviting an emanation of divinity to join you in your sukkah on each night, a different one of each of the 7 lower sfirot. And that's what these second 2 texts all deal with. That you're supposed to invite human guests and you're supposed to invite supernal guests, which are the sfirot. So I think I'm gonna stop sharing there and see if anyone has any comments or questions at this point before we go on to Isaac Luria. Nancy Rubel and then Julie.
I have a question I'm not even sure how to ask, but this has happened for me recently with another rabbinic teaching experience I had about mystical interpretations of things. It seems so made up. It seems like they just read these verses, like the first example was a great one, and then they believe that, oh, it's the Sphirot, and it's like just an imaginary thing where are they getting these? I don't even know how to ask my question. I see Lila nodding. I appreciate that. I don't, if anybody could help me ask this question, that would be helpful, because when we do other text study, it's some groundedness in like what the word means and what the root of the word is and that kind of thing. But this has this kind of made up quality to me that's just somebody's imaginary way of applying the concepts to what they're reading. Do you know what I'm trying to ask here?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's a great. I think you're asking it very well. I mean, I would say they're using a particular lens, right, to look at the text, and it's a lens that is very compelling to them, and it's a lens that they believe is connected to the deepest truth of the universe. And I will say that this the way that the Zohar reads these texts is not really different from the way Maimonides reads these texts. I mean, it is different in content, but the goal and the process is very similar, because Maimonides is at pains to show that the Torah is philosophically sophisticated. And so anytime there's a description of God that seems like it's talking about God in a concrete way, in the Guide for the Perplexed, Maimonides says, oh, this is not really talking about God in a concrete way. This is, here's why it's not. Here's what's really going on. And he would explain it that, it's all allegorical. And he has a key to the allegory. So,
Yeah.
so in the medieval period, there are all these different Jewish thinkers that are coming out of different spiritual and intellectual traditions, and the Torah is a central text in their tradition, and it's very important to them that they stay connected to the Torah. The Torah, they believe, is divine revelation, and they're also very grounded in a particular kind of intellectual spiritual framework that is somewhat in tension, or more than somewhat in tension, with the simple meaning of the Torah. And so there are lots of medieval projects that are focused on helping people to see what the real truth is. That's why there's this pardes, the 4 levels of the text, and each level is theoretically progressively deeper. And so it's what this, to me, this is also right. This is connected to Lila's question before too, which I definitely want to come back to. But they're starting off presuming the Sfirot and presuming the Torah as a vehicle that's teaching about the Sfirot, and they're listening for that. They're wearing those glasses. They're wearing Sfirotic glasses, and they're reading the text, and they're seeing what they're seeing.
That's really helpful, because it's almost, I think what I'm hearing you say is that each are divinely inspired, the Sfirot system and the Torah, and they're saying they're both ways of communicating the truth, and they're trying to see how they overlap, how they influence each other, how they both work together.
Right. They have to work together, or else the religious lives of these people fall apart. Right? They have to show that they are of a piece, because they're equally committed to the Torah on one hand, and in this case to the Kabbalistic way of viewing the universe on the other.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. All right, Julie, and then Lila.
Well, what you said really mitigates my concern about it. The allegorical nature of it really disturbed me. To think that this is not really this, it's really this, with an equal sign, that is antithetical to my view of mysticism. And it's hard to explain without talking about an English example I had when I was little. A teacher was trying to teach us the difference between simile, metaphor, and a third thing. Maybe it was synecdoche. Dew sparkles like diamonds in the grass, simile. The dew drops are diamonds in the grass. That's metaphor. Diamonds sparkle in the grass. I think of mysticism as diamonds sparkling in the grass. But what you said does clarify that they need to separate. Do you see what I'm saying? The allegorical separation really bothered me. Saying that this isn't it. It's really, this isn't, this is really a cloud. It's not what it is. I don't,
Well,
I guess I'm not making,
no, you are. No, you're making
No.
total sense. I mean, I think I hear what you're saying. I just want to use an analogy from a different tradition and see if this makes it any, I don't know if this helps or not, but
okay.
think about Plato's cave analogy. Okay, so does that, I don't know if you have feelings about, I mean, I'm not a big, I don't know a whole lot about Plato, but we did read the cave analogy at one point, and right, so the cave analogy where some people see the shadows on the inside of the cave, but the real truth, if you want to really know what's going on, you have to leave the cave and go out into the sun and see what's actually generating the shadows in the first place, right? So to me, the way the Zohar reads the Torah is kind of in a similar way. Like it's saying, the surface level of the Torah is like you're inside the cave, you're seeing something that's connected to reality, but it's a very thin, it's a very partial view. So
the more you explain it, the more I see it, feel it. But at first, it really.
The problem is what Nancy was talking about too. The problem is you have a text that you're committed to. Like if there was no Torah, they wouldn't have to go through this whole process, right? They could just be mystics, but there's a Torah that doesn't look like it conforms to their mystical orientation. And so they have to go through a process of, transforming their understanding of the text so that those two things fit together for them, because they're both equally necessary.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. Lila?
So I was thinking about listening to Nancy's question is what came to my mind was something like that we talked about when I have a doctorate in literary theory and English literature. So we would always say, as you move through post-structuralism and different theories, like, so what's the explanatory value? What compels you about this particular reading of this text as opposed to a different one? And as I hear you explain it, it occurs to me that we are so cut loose from any literal understanding of the Torah, right? There's no danger that we're going to think that there's an actual number of years or an actual number of heaps of, whatever, that we already read it, if not allegorically, at least metaphorically, so that in some ways maybe, I guess when you said what the words you said were that they're looking for a deeper understanding of the Torah. And so we already sort of read it deep to begin with, right? So can you say, just as part of this, the pardes, the four levels of?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think that whole approach. So so there are four. So it's pardes because it's four Hebrew letters: Pei, Resh, Dalet, Samech, which spells pardes, which is an orchard, and the mystical reality is described metaphorically as an orchard very often. And so the four letters stand for Peshat is simple. So that's the obvious meaning of the surface meaning of the text. Remez means hint. So that's supposed to talk about that's supposed to refer to the allegorical, meaning, there's drash is like midrash, where you kind of, you make the connections that we're used to the rabbis making in the Talmud, or, when they look at a word in one context and the same word in a different context, and they say, oh, these two words are actually talking about the same thing, and therefore these two verses are actually related to each other. And the samech is for sod, which is secret, and that refers to the mystical level of the text. So I think the mystics, not surprisingly, are the ones who came up with this rubric, because their level is the deepest, right? It's, you get to the sod, and that's the truest. But that's what the four levels. In modern Jewish scholarship, I don't know that people privilege any one level over another level, but I think in the mystical tradition, it was clear that the sod level was the most true. The last thing I'll say about this, and then Alan has a question, is that this ties into a very core Reconstructionist concept, or two related Reconstructionist concepts of revaluing and transvaluing. Okay? And I should remember which one was which, and I don't always remember, so maybe someone will have it at the top at their fingertips. But one of those terms refers to reframing the meaning of something without recognizing that you're doing that. So, and Mordechai Kaplan said, that's what Jewish people have done throughout Jewish history. That's what Maimonides did. He was a devotee of Aristotle, and he reframed the entire Jewish tradition, as that, in a way that would fit with Aristotelian philosophy. So let's just say that's revaluing. Okay, so that's he said, and the way he said it was, oh, now I understand what this is truly meant to be. Like all these generations that came before me, they didn't understand, but now because I have the Aristotelian frame, I can actually understand what's going on here. So he thought he had the real truth of the Torah for the first time. The Kabbalists would have said the same thing. But when you transvalue, the difference between revalue and transvalue is that you're conscious of the fact that you are imbuing a tradition or a text with a new meaning that it didn't have previously. So that's the difference. So we could say that the Kabbalists and Maimonides and many other Jewish historical figures did a lot of revaluation. They reconstructed, but they did it unconsciously. And one of the things that we think might be different about modernity and postmodernity is that we're aware of our process of reconstruction. All right, Alan.
Yeah, I was just going to mention a modern guy who reframed. I don't know if you've come across Lawrence Kushner.
Sure.
Yeah, and he takes, like, for example, I remember he took the story of the fall of, the sin, and he completely turned it around and said, God said, hey, there's this tree now, don't eat the fruit of this tree. God was saying to them, in a sense, yeah, well, I could have put that tree in the back of the forest, or somewhere that you couldn't see it. God wanted them to eat, because eating the tree of knowledge is like a step in the development of people to be independent thinkers, and so that's his whole book. God was in this place, and I did not know.
Right.
He reimagines all of those stories in a different take. So they're modern mystics as well, I guess.
Absolutely. He's a modern mystic. He is, and he's very psychologically oriented, right? So I think in that book, he has all these different psychologists analyzing Jacob's dream, and or Jacob's statement, I was in this place and I did not know it. And it's a really creative text. But he is a modern mystic. So yeah, I think anything he writes
Yeah.
is worth reading. So
Just so
thank
you know, I tried to get him as a scholar in residence, just a little bit too expensive for us. Close.
yeah.
Yeah.
And my mother went to high school with him in Detroit. That's my biggest claim to fame. That's all right. Thank you. All right, I see Ron and I see Art Biajanti.
Well, I just was briefly, I was reminded of a slogan that's out there. Is knowledge is structured in consciousness. Knowledge is structured in consciousness. So the more aware we are, whatever we are, that's what we're going to be able to interpret and understand. If we're a senior in high school and we're reading Tolstoy, we get one level. If we're after we've lived a lifetime, we go back to the great writers, the great thinkers, the great philosophers. We have a totally different perspective on what we're looking at. So I think that's another way of saying what you've been saying.
Yeah, no, that's great, Ron. And I will just add to that list the Torah, right? Because that's the
Yeah, I was.
right? Because it goes through. You talk about we go through the same text every year, but very often, this is my experience at least, I'll see something in the text that in some Torah portion that I've never noticed before. It's almost funny to me when it happens. Like, oh my God, how did I not notice that before? Now this year, for whatever reason, it's jumping out at me. So
You're in a different place than you were.
absolutely,
You have more
absolutely,
experience. You lived your life and you learned more in that year, so you're able to see more.
right, right. So there's so absolutely there. How whatever the structure of our inner world has such a powerful impact on what we perceive in the world around us, right? And what we pay attention to, what we notice and what we understand, how we connect the dots, all those things. So yeah, thank you very much, Ron. Art, we got to get you unmuted. There we go.
Sorry about that.
Oh.
The Bahir, is that also a way to interpret Torah or a tool to help interpret?
Yeah. So right. So the Bahir is probably the earliest truly Kabbalistic text that exists. It kind of appears. No one even knows where it came from. The author was anonymous. It seems to be connected to some earlier manuscripts, but it appears in the middle of the 12th century at the very beginning of this Kabbalistic phase of the Jewish mystical tradition. And I don't, and I'll have to double check on this, Art, but I don't think the Bahir is structured in the same way that the Zohar is. Like the bulk of the Zohar is structured as a mystical midrash on the Torah. And it's not all of it, but I don't know, 70%. And it's exactly what we've been talking about in terms of kind of, pulling out the hidden references to the Sfirot using the language hints. I don't think the Bahir is structured in that way, but I'm not 100% certain, and I will double check on that. And it's a fine question. Well, I'm a little reluctant to even dive into Sfat actually because we only have a few minutes, but I appreciate everybody's questions and thinking, and I do think let me just say one sentence about Lila's question because I don't want us to forget it. I think we can look at the particulars of the there are two levels that we can look at all this stuff on, and there's the specifics, and then there's the underlying principle. And at the level of the underlying principle, the conviction that what we do in our lives matters in a really profound way to the future of our world and even the well-being of God, of divinity. Like, we actually, what we do has an impact on that. To me, that's kind of where I focus on, like, what's compelling about this on a spiritual level. Like the particulars of thinking about which sphera is being activated at which time. By the way, we probably are not gonna get there in the context of this mini course. We might have to do a whole separate series on Hasidism. But by the way, what Hasidism does is it gets rid of all the specifics of the mystical tradition and it keeps the principles. And it says, you know what, all this technical Kabbalistic stuff is actually getting in the way, and it's too heavy and it's too distracting. And if you really want people to live spiritual lives, let's just focus on the underlying principles of Kabbalah and not worry about all of the specifics. And that was the Baal Shem Tov's genius. And that's why, in my opinion, Hasidism is the most interesting and personally exciting version of the Jewish mystical tradition, because it didn't see the necessity of maintaining that kind of strict adherence to, focusing on, it was like, I said at one point that this was like a spiritual version of quantum mechanics. And I think that's what, like, the Hasidim said, it's like, you don't need all that stuff to really benefit from the core insights. And the major core insight is that what we do has immense import to the cosmos as a whole, and to our lives and to the lives of the people we care about. And that's a faith statement, but I can see that it's like, I can see the power of it for people, so that's what I think. That's what I think it comes down to. And it's a whole new rationale for observing the mitzvot. I'm just reading your message. So it depends on which version you're talking about. Again, this was the genius of Hasidism. It said you didn't have to be a scholar to be a spiritual Jew. And you didn't have to be a Talmud scholar, and you didn't have to be a mystical scholar. You just had to know a few important, things to focus on, and you probably needed a Rebbe to keep you on the right path. That's okay. The Rebbe part is a little bit, I'm not so wild about that part of Hasidism, so you can be, I don't know if you can be a Kabbalist proper and be illiterate, actually. I think that would be quite difficult, unless you were in the Abulafian school. But even then, you probably would need to read some stuff, or you would need a teacher. Yeah, it's a good question. So, all right. Nancy, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to comment, the timing of this is really pretty remarkable, because Steve and I didn't coordinate these thoughts together. But when we count the Omer, we're going to be using the Sfirot to do that. There's a whole mystical tradition that comes out of this time period.
Right.
And that's the way I've been counting for years, which uses each Sfirot on a weekly basis, interacting with a different Sfirot every day, to understand what are the characteristics on that day that's represented and how to take that into heart and mind to make that a significant moment. And I imagine they did a lot of that. I imagine they used all these different systems to figure out how does that inform our lives. And this was one of the things that, is a method that I think is pretty interesting and informative. And
Absolutely.
so,
Yeah, that's a great
I'm not an
example.
expert. I found this, but I don't know beyond that. But I imagine they have other, like the way isn't the Sabbath Bride? Doesn't that come out of mysticism too? Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, the whole and well, a lot of these things came, were developed in Svat. But yeah, the counting of the Omer, the way you described it with the mystical overlay, Kabbalat Shabbat as a ritual, the inviting the guests, Ushpizin to Sukkot, that comes out of the same. The Tu B'Shvat Seder, by the way, comes out
really.
of the same. Yeah. So this was a and this is all. Now we're talking more about Svat. So we haven't actually talked too much about Svat yet, but Svat was a culmination of what came before. So Svat was this burst of spiritual creativity that lasted about 100 years, not quite, 75 years. And we'll talk about that next time. And then we'll see if, I don't know, maybe we'll have to see if we want to schedule a part 2 focused on a little bit on the Hasidic tradition later on this summer or something. So, all right. Thank you, everybody. It was great being with you tonight. And see you next Sunday at 7:30, if not before. Okay. Take care. Bye.